Hello and welcome to the second in a unique set of video briefings from DC employment solicitors arising as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented impact that it's having on employment law. In our first collection of videos, I'll be looking at the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, or furlough scheme for short. In the first episode, I talked about who's actually covered by the scheme and answered some of the frequently asked questions that many of our clients have asked since it was first introduced. In this episode, I'll be taking a look at the nuts and bolts of implementation of the furlough scheme by employers. Now, this video was recorded on the 7th of April and takes into account the government's updated guidance published on the 4th of April. However, as the guidance is continually changing, in order to keep updated, please have a look at our guidance notes on our website. All of the links are below, which are regularly refreshed as more information comes to light. Once again, apologies for the rather amateurish production quality of this video. I'm filming this from my study in Tibble Towers rather than our fancy studio in the office. Firstly, and by way of a very brief reminder, the government introduced the furlough scheme in order to avoid redundancies by reducing the pressure on employers to continue paying wages in full during the crisis period. In simple terms, the scheme allows employers to agree with their employees that they'll be put on temporary leave of absence, otherwise known as furlough, which then allows the employer to recover a proportion of pay from HMRC in respect of employees on furlough. Given that the reimbursement that employers can seek per employee is limited to the lower of 80% of wage costs or £2,500 per calendar month, plus employer national insurance contributions and employer auto-enrolment pension contributions, it's understandably proving to be popular amongst many employers. All of this was dealt with in more detail in episode 1, so let's get started. Firstly, what steps must employers take to put employees on furlough leave? Now, the government guidance says that employers should discuss the proposal with staff and make changes to the employment contract by agreement. It's a condition of eligibility for reimbursement that furlough leave is confirmed to the employee in writing. Unfortunately, the phase furloughing staff has given the impression that it's purely the decision of employers. But I can't emphasise enough the importance of obtaining employee agreement. Failure to do so could result in firstly staff claiming at a later date that there was no formal change to their terms and therefore they're owed full pay for the furlough period, and secondly there's a serious risk the government won't pay its 80% contribution as a result. So from a practical perspective, employers will need to firstly decide which employees to designate as furloughed employees. Secondly, they've got to notify furloughed employees of the intended change. Then employers need to consider whether it needs to consult with employee representatives or trade unions. Then they've got to agree the change with the furloughed employees. Most employment contracts won't permit an employer to reduce an employee's pay or provide them with no work and change their employment status without agreement. However, faced with the alternatives, which are likely to be unpaid leave, layoff or redundancy, the majority of affected employees are likely to agree to be placed on furlough leave, and indeed that's what we have been seeing with most of our clients to date. It's also worth mentioning at this stage that unpaid leave or layoff is only a viable option if either the contract of employment permits it or the employee consents. So if you get the employee's consent to furlough leave, you must then confirm the employee's new status in writing. As I've said, this is an eligibility requirement for accessing the subsidy, and a record must be kept of this correspondence. Ideally, the employer should advise the employee how long it expects furlough leave to continue. However, this might be difficult in the current climate. Employers may wish to put employees on furlough leave for an initial period subject to review. Then the employer must submit information to HMRC about the employees that have been furloughed and their earnings through the new online portal, which is expected to be operational by the end of April. Finally, it's important to ensure that the employees don't carry out any further work for that employer while they're furloughed. So, how does an employer decide who to put onto furlough? An employer could initially ask for volunteers. However, in some cases an employer may receive more volunteers that it wants to furlough. So the procedure an employer follows to decide which employees to furlough may depend on its current financial situation. If the employer needs to very urgently furlough employees or make them redundant in order to be able to continue to trade, a limited selection procedure carried out on an urgent basis is likely to be acceptable. However, where an employer doesn't have any immediate financial concerns, it's likely to be more reasonable for it to follow a more comprehensive procedure. Employers could draw up a matrix of objective criteria in a similar way to redundancy scoring. Now, whatever happens, employers should ensure that their decisions on who to designate for furlough leave are not based on discriminatory criteria, except where such discrimination is likely to be justified. For example, it would be discriminatory for employers to use age as a criteria and select employees over 70. However, this could be justified as a proportionate means of achieving the legitimate aim of protecting the health and safety of vulnerable employees as identified in government guidance. It's important to note that government guidance makes clear that equality and discrimination laws apply in the usual way in this context. Next, can an employer rotate furlough between its employees? The employer's furlough guidance issued by the government says that employees must be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks. This is in keeping with the current requirements for as many people to avoid leaving their homes as much as possible. Since employers are likely to receive many requests or volunteers to be placed on furlough leave, it's likely to assist employee relations for employers to be able to move employees on and off furlough leave, subject to that minimum 3-week period, so that no employee feels that they've been unfairly denied the opportunity to take furlough leave. The guidance does confirm that employees can be furloughed multiple times, subject to the minimum 3 consecutive week period. Can an employee request their employer puts them onto furlough leave? Yes, an employee can request this, but the employer doesn't have to agree. It's the employer's decision which employees to place on furlough leave, if any. It's also the employer's decision whether to place employees on furlough leave or make them redundant. Potentially redundant employees don't have a right to require their employer to place them on furlough leave as an alternative to redundancy. However, the government hopes that many employers will see the new scheme as preferable to business closure and making redundancies. It's currently unclear whether refusing to place an employee on furlough leave and making them redundant could amount to an unfair dismissal. The obvious danger is that employees who are being made redundant instead of being furloughed will claim the employer jumped too soon instead of waiting during the furlough leave period, which would have cost them very little to see how things panned out. We've noticed that in practice so far, it's staff who've been asked to continue working rather than be furloughed who've been more concerned. It may seem unfair that some employees will be required to continue working, potentially increasing their risk of infection if they're unable to work from home, and others will be permitted to receive a substantial proportion of salary and not be required to do so. However, provided the employer has used appropriate, non-discriminatory criteria to choose who is granted furlough leave, it's possible for an employer to lawfully choose to furlough only part of the workforce. Will employers need to collectively consult if they intend to put 20 or more employees on furlough leave? The government guidance has confirmed that if sufficient numbers of employees are involved, then it may be necessary to engage in collective consultation to obtain agreement to change the employee's terms. It's therefore clear that there's no exception to the obligation to collectively consult in this context where the duty arises. However, this is likely only to be the case where the employer envisages making 20 or more employees redundant, or where there are agreements that require consultation for changes to terms and conditions. It may be the case that employers are seeking only to get agreement on furlough, and redundancy in those numbers isn't envisaged at that point. Arguably, the duty doesn't arise at the initial stage where simply consent is being sought. Now, if you do have any concerns about this, then it's always worth getting in touch. Can an employer defer payment to furloughed employees until reimbursement is received from HMRC? Now, some employers won't be able to continue to pay 80% of employee salaries until the HMRC portal is up and running and reimbursements received. Therefore, they've got the option of either making the employees redundant, although this will have its own associated costs, or putting the employees on unpaid leave until the HMRC portal is up and running, or reaching an agreement with the affected employees that they will be furloughed now, but that payment of their salaries will be deferred until reimbursements received from HMRC. Next, are employers obliged to top up the remaining 20%? Employers have the option to continue paying full pay during furlough leave, but they're not obliged to. If they do top up, they can only claim back employer national insurance contributions and minimum auto-enrolment payments up to the cap. Withholding 20% of an employee's salary will, however, amount to a breach of contract and an unlawful deduction of wages unless the employee gives their consent. As I've said, it's expected that the majority of employees will consent, since furlough leave is a better alternative than unpaid leave, layoff, or indeed redundancy. So that was a swift tour through how you implement furloughing. As I've mentioned, the guidance on this topic is rapidly changing, and therefore it's always sensible to keep checking the guidance or our website for the most up-to-date information. In the next episode, I'll take a look at the nitty-gritty of what happens during furlough, including employee rights with regards to holiday pay, notice pay, etc. And I'll also again answer some of the frequently asked questions on that topic and more. Thanks for watching.